Hi, Dr. Boyce. Thanks for coming in and doing this with me. I've wanted to, like I told you earlier, wanted to talk to you for a while about your work. So it's cool to do this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here, and I love to talk about psychology, and I love to talk about writing.
Yeah.
So the intersection of the two is something that I am particularly passionate about, and happy to be here.
Yeah. So just for a quick intro, so you're a psychology professor at Ohio State, and an author. You have two books out, Hot British Boyfriend and Hot Dutch Daydream. And the third one, Dungeons and Drama, is coming out in January, so that's cool. Um, I took your Psych to the Self class over the summer, and on that first day you mentioned how you had both jobs, and I'd always been interested in how psychology and creativity kind of work together, being a psych major myself and doing various like creative projects throughout my life. So I've always been interested in that. So I was just interested to hear your story and throughout your life how these two things have kind of come together. So my understanding is that you've always been interested in creative writing ever since you were a child. So I was wondering how that developed, what inspired you to do that, and I guess just kind of what took your interest initially.
Yeah. So absolutely correct. It was always creative writing that I loved the most. I don't have that one light bulb memory of like, me realizing that I wanted to be a writer. I think it was a slower process of me reading and loving books. And then it was actually one of my best friends who, I think her parents had kind of pushed her a little bit to think about some writing, maybe just, to kind of help her with school. And then she was like, oh, what about if we wrote a story together? And so we would alternate chapters, and we would, this is back in like the 90s. And so we'd have our little notebook and we'd pass it back and forth and we'd write our chapters. And that got me kind of started with the idea of storytelling. And, of course, none of it was, particularly great writing, but it was still fun to be creative and to do it in kind of a low stakes, fun sort of way. And then, for her, it kind of faded. But for me, I just really realized how much I loved it. And so I started writing books on my own. And that continued. That was probably late elementary when it started. And then through junior high and high school and even into college.
Uh, I saw you talk before about how, so growing up out in Coshocton, my parents are from Dover, so I'm like
Oh,
somewhat
yeah.
familiar with that kind of area.
Sure.
Um, so you had always liked kind of wandering around by yourself and like being out in nature. Did that have an influence on the kind of like stories that you like, just being in your own world and just coming up with stuff like out wandering around?
I think it did, yeah. And it's so funny now as an adult, I can look back at so much stuff in my life and kind of see all of those ways in which it had an impression on me that at the time I didn't realize. To me, it was just regular life. But, some of it was the books I was
Yeah.
reading, because back then I was reading a lot of, like, kind of what I'd call now like middle grade fantasy novels. So I had a lot of fantasy elements, but then I lived out in the country, out in the forest, and I'd spent a lot of time out in the forest. And so when I think back to like one of my earliest and most beloved books, I mean, it wasn't really a book, but the thing that I wrote, it was all taking place in these forests that were really just exactly what was around my house. And so I was definitely pulling from the things that were around me to kind of get that inspiration.
One of the things I thought was interesting was that you had said for your first draft that you like walking and doing voice dictation. Do you think that like that has something to do with it, like being outside, just kind of wandering around? Like it sounds like it's kind of like do you think that helps you come up with ideas in a similar way that like back when you were a kid?
Oh, that's interesting. I had never really put those two things together or thought about that, and so I don't know. It's very possible that maybe other people wouldn't feel the same way that I do about it. That they might find it to be stressful or just not a creative process in the way that I do. Because it is true that I don't hear a lot of people who will write the way that I do with my dictating and my walking.
Yeah.
But I think also for me, it's that when I'm sitting in front of the computer and I see those words kind of on the page, or I see a blank page with nothing, sometimes it's very daunting and it's hard to really get my brain going, and I start kind of I'm easily like, oh, I should go do laundry. I should go do something else, even though it doesn't sound very much fun. So when I'm out,
Yeah.
I can't go do laundry. I can't be distracted. And I can also just kind of get the words out of my brain without as many, like kind of second guessing myself. And so I think that's helped me a lot.
Yeah, I do that for like if I'm listening to an audiobook or a podcast or something and want to take notes. I love doing voice dictation. I feel like it makes my brain feel a lot better just to
Yeah.
walk around and like be able to think freely. So I thought it was interesting that you do that. Um, so you continued writing up throughout middle and high school. Is that I'd heard you mention that you had mostly thought that it would kind of just be a hobby and you do something else. Was that always the case, or was it kind of like a back and forth of like I'm not sure which one to pick?
It was always the case that I thought it was going to be a hobby, but the reason why is that growing up in Coshocton, which, I love the town, but it was a very small place, and I really grew up not knowing anything about authors or publishing or how any of it worked. It wasn't the case. I mean, I know in some schools they'll bring in authors for special days and they'll do talks. I never had any experiences like that. So I just kind of had it in my head that whatever writing and publishing was, it was something that was grand and it was beyond what I could do. I didn't have any inkling of how to get into it, and it just seemed so daunting and, to be honest, a little bit embarrassing to have to tell my parents or my friends, hey, I'm going to grow up and be a published author, because it just sounded like, I don't know, I just, like,
Yeah,
oh, okay, go ahead and
yeah,
try to do that, like
yeah,
this kind of ridiculous thing.
yeah,
So I didn't really let myself think about it as being a reality.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes sense. It's definitely something where like you worry about people being like, yeah, like that's cute. Go get a real job though. It's like
Exactly.
fun. But so so going into college, how did you end up? Were you always interested in psychology? How'd you end up taking those classes and going down that route?
Yeah, that's kind of a weird story too. So like in at the end of high school, my senior year, I did the program where you can take college classes but get the college credit and the high school credit at the same time. So I was actually going to the Ohio University in Zanesville, OUZ, and I took the intro psychology class there, and I did well in it. It's so again, it's just so weird because like I did well enough in that class that they asked me to tutor it, and I did tutor it, and yet somehow I did well in the class, and I didn't understand what psychology was. Like I took the class and I tutored the class, and I still left thinking psychology equals therapy and therapy alone. And I don't know, I can't make sense of
Mhm.
it. I feel kind of silly saying it, but when I came into Ohio State, I was undecided. Psychology was not on my radar. I had liked it and I had done well and I'd resonated with it, but I didn't want to be a therapist, only because I just kind of knew myself and my mental health that I knew I was the kind of person who would work with a patient and then I would take all those problems home at the end of the night, and I wouldn't be able to find that
Mhm.
balance. And I just didn't think it was going to be like a long-term, like kind of healthy situation for me. And so, yeah, when I came into
Yeah.
Ohio State, I was completely undecided. I had thought about being an English major. I thought about being communications because I was, focused on writing. Um, None of those, journalism, things like that, none of those things really spoke to me in the same sort of way. And, I know people will say this about psychology sometimes, but I definitely heard a few kind of negative things about being an English major, that's going to get you a job at
Sure.
McDonald's or, whatever the kind of rude things are that people say. And so I didn't do that.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of looking around through the GEs trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do.
Yeah. So you end up getting into psychology, and then were you still writing in college,
So I did get a creative writing
like
minor,
in
and
undergrad?
so I
Yeah.
was as an undergraduate. I did do a creative writing minor, and that asks you to do some short stories. But then, as you well know, during the semester you're very busy and don't have a lot of time. So I wasn't really doing any
Yeah.
real like kind of writing on my own. But in the summers, I would go back. I had this one story that I'm never going to publish it, but it was this thing that I held on to and kind of slowly worked on it for a lot of years. So sometimes I would do that on the summer or in the summers in between my years at Ohio State.
Did you ever have the thoughts then of combining the two, or was it kind of just like you just kind of had them being separate?
Yeah, again, to me, it was pretty separate. It was really only as a
Yeah.
professor that I then, in fact, it was only as a professor, and then once I started like looking back at my writing that I realized, oh, these two are really intimately tied together. It's in some ways kind of two
Yeah.
manifestations of the same general thing, but it took me a surprisingly long time to put that two and two together there.
So you had said that you took a break during getting your PhD, which was 5 years. Is that
Five
right?
years. Yep.
Were you just completely off, or would you dabble here and there, or like did you just kind of put it aside because of the load of a PhD?
Right. I for the most part I put it aside. I in the summers I would find some time to read, and that kind of I mean to some extent I guess kind of kept me in the kind of creative mindset. But I will say there was this one time I
Hmm.
think it was my fourth year of graduate school. I got the chance to kind of study abroad. We had like this sister school in Germany, and I was able to go over there for a month. And the idea was that I would be giving presentations and maybe collaborating on research and doing psychology related things. And it's not that I didn't do that. It's just that I
Hmm.
also kind of had a lot of time on my hands. My husband wasn't there. I was just kind of sitting in this like little dorm room type of thing. And so it was funny to me that like as soon as I had a little bit of like a mental break with nothing to do, my brain went back to writing. And I pulled out that story that I've mentioned a few times, and I started writing it. And I was almost like, what's going on with my brain? But I think it was me saying, as soon as I have the cognitive load for it, that's where I'm going to go back to. I can't really give it up because it's just a part of me.
Yeah. So you started writing much more after getting the PhD. At that point, had your mind changed from before you had said it's probably going to be a hobby and I'm going to have another job? Was that the same after getting the PhD, or did you decide coming out that you wanted to pursue it professionally? What was that transition like?
That was the transition. It was exactly what you described. Is before I finished my PhD. So
Oh.
like in undergrad, it wasn't something I was thinking about. During graduate school, I mean, one other thing that kind of happened during graduate school was that I realized that I love social psychology. I love to teach. I I was happy to do the research, but when I thought about what it meant to spend my entire life devoted to research in the way that you often do in academia, I just didn't see that passion.
Hmm.
And that kind of opened me up to the idea that like maybe I need to think about the other things I am passionate about and see if I can find that balance. And I think I also came out of my PhD
Yeah.
with a lot more confidence than I had had at any other time in my life to really, for the first time, think, hey, if you can get a PhD, why can't you research and see what it takes to be a or to be a published book author? People are out there doing it, so why couldn't it be you? And before, I never had thought that. So that was
Yeah.
really the changing point for me.
Yeah. And so that was that around 2008?
It was,
That was
yes, it was
when
2008.
you started writing again after.
Exactly.
And then, so to getting published in 2019, what what was that journey like? That 10 year, I guess. Were you constantly like writing and submitting things to try and get published that whole time? What was that path like?
So, at the time when I started, I thought I was taking it seriously. I can now look back and say that I really wasn't. Like, I wasn't really using my time wisely, and I wasn't really doing all the things
Yeah.
I needed to do. It was kind of a slow process. I also had this
Yeah.
kind of silly notion that I would be able to just get published in secret. I wouldn't have to tell anybody or get any help, and I could just announce to everybody, I'm a published author now. And that's not really how it usually goes.
Yeah.
And so those early years were
Right.
slow, and then my husband and I decided we wanted to have a baby, and so I had my son in 2012. And as you might imagine, that kind of slows things down a little bit too. Hard to have the newborn and the novel at the same time. Although people do it, they're amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was probably, I would say it was maybe when my son turned one in 2013 that I really was like, okay, I'm going to double down. This is what I really want to do. By that time, I had learned more
Yeah.
also about what publishing was like and kind of what the steps were. And so I would say those kind of 5 years or
Yeah.
5 or 6 years, that was when I really was serious about it. And
I
I guess
think
to add a little bit
for a
more,
lot of
I
people who.
was, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, no, go ahead. You're good.
I was just going to say that you were asking about whether I was submitting that whole time, and I did write. So I wrote a novel, submitted it, and then got rejected, which is very common in publishing. And then I had my son, and
Yeah.
then after my son, I wrote another novel, submitted it, again got that rejection. I dabbled in a few other things, and then the next real thing that I wrote was Hot British Boyfriend. But that was also a long process to get that published.
Mhm. Yeah. I think a lot of people, especially young people that want to do something like that, it's hard to process how much time and how much volume it is probably going to take. Did you have any specific strategies or anything for kind of staying patient, or did it not really feel like did it feel like a grind, or not really, just because you like doing it? Like, were there
It was a grind,
how'd that
yeah.
go in your mind? Yeah.
I mean, it was absolutely a grind, but I also love doing it. And like publishing is hard. I mean, a lot of things, a lot of creative pursuits are hard, and there's a lot of rejection, and it can really take a toll on you. And so there was a time when I thought about quitting. In fact, I did. I told myself, I'm going to quit. I've tried. I'm done. And then I found my brain just kind of going back once again to stories and to writing. And I kind of came to this realization: whether you get published or not, you're always going to be a writer. Because being published doesn't. You don't have to be published to be a writer. If you're writing, then you're a writer. And so I was like, you know what, I'm just going to keep doing this, and I was kind of dramatic about it, but I was like, I'm going to do this either until I die or until I get published. One of those two things is going to happen.
Yeah.
And, not to
Yeah.
be weird about it, but I'm just going to keep going. And luckily it was, that I actually got published. So that was good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I thought it was interesting also, especially connected to the class, the Psych of the Self class I took with you over the summer. You've talked about writing young adult fiction, and how a lot of the characters are, it's that transitional period in life when you're trying to find your way and figure out who you are, and like what path you're going to take, and you're dealing with people trying to kind of tell you what to do and where to go. And I thought that was interesting, because that ties in almost perfectly with a lot of the Psych of the Self concepts that we had been talking about. So was that something that just, like, if it seems like it fits like a glove, was that something that just kind of just happened, and it just happened to work out fitting together that well?
I, it, you know, Yes, kind of that it happened to work out, but it was always the case that I was drawn to that age group. Like I definitely have read novels
Mm.
written for younger people. I've read a lot of adult novels, but whenever I tried to write myself, it always seemed like people will talk about voice, like the voice that you have as a writer, and it always just seemed like I was kind of drawn to that age group. And I know some people who are,
Yeah.
they're able to write a 10-year-old's voice, and they kind of have that figured out. And for whatever reason, it was, always a case that I felt like that younger kind of teenage voice was a little easier for me, and I just like those stories so much. And as you said, I like that idea that you're kind of on that precipice of like making all those decisions and understanding yourself, and that always just is such a it's a big and it's an emotional time and it's an important time, but it's also a really exciting time, and I just think that's such a fun place to write from. So I think that's why I've been always drawn to it.
So I heard you talking about, or read it, I can't remember, the idea for Hot British Boyfriend originating from a multiple choice question, I think, between, what was it, self-evaluation and self-validation,
It
and
was
that, like, how that kind of, how those two, I guess, can kind of conflict with each other. Is that, have you been very deliberate in trying to like put those concepts and embody them in characters, or I guess, are you a little bit more subtle about it and leaving it more open to interpretation? Like, is that something where you've been like, oh, I know this concept, and like I know I can fit this in, or has it just kind of happened more naturally?
So, with the exception, so that, like you said, that book was inspired by that multiple choice question. So, kind of by definition, of course, that was the starting point and definitely is a big part of that. If you happen to know those terms, if you've never taken that class or studied psychology, I think you could read that book and have no idea that it's related to that, not like, kind of giving, vocabulary terms or what have you. Because
Yeah.
I don't want it to feel
Okay.
like that, yeah, I don't want it to be this kind of weird like
Right.
education slash whatever novel. So with that exception, if I look at my books, I can see places where, like, oh, I know they're doing this because it's a self fulfilling prophecy, or I know they're self handicapping, or like I can throw those terms
Right.
in. But
Mm.
it's something I think I kind of do. It's just because that's the world, though, right? Like, social psychology tells you why we do what we do. And so when you're writing characters, I can apply that same
Yeah.
social psychology to them, but I don't need to, like, I try not to make it so, like, obvious, but I don't know if I do a good job or not. But I don't want it to be like real professory.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think we've kind of reached time here, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up. But yeah, thanks a lot for coming on and doing this and talking to me. It's been cool to learn more about your journey, and yeah, good luck with the rest of the semester and the launch of Dungeons and Drama in January. It's gonna be I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out and seeing that come to fruition like the other two.
Yes, I am excited for that too. So hopefully, there's a lot of D&D fans out there. So hopefully, a few of them will pick it up. And I just want to say thank you for having me. It's always so fun to get to chat about these kinds of things. And you had lots of great questions. And so hopefully, this will help out some other people. And I guess I'll just end by saying that whatever you're passionate about, I feel like it's really worth it to try to put the time in to make it happen, because it can happen, even if it seems impossible at times. So I would just
Yeah.
tell everybody to kind of go after the things that they love.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.